question for today when it comes to our dog's emotions. Are fear and anxiety different? And perhaps, more importantly, does it matter? We talk sometimes in the dog world of words being labels, and sometimes these labels can be really unhelpful. So just last week, I phoned my vet to say that my dog Lydia has got a lump on her head. And that was clearly a very unhelpful label for whatever I was looking at, and it did not help my vet know at all what that lump was until we'd had a quick trip to see her in person to confirm that it's just a small sebaceous cyst. So one person's lump is another person's sebaceous cyst, and labels can be very unhelpful if they don't communicate clearly. Sometimes labels can be used in a pejorative or a euphemistic sense. Like, I don't like calling Liddy an aggressive dog because that word aggression is rarely used in a neutral way. Indeed, in the UK, having a sign on my gate maybe saying you own an aggressive dog could be taken as a complication in terms of legal liability. When Lydia and I went to the vet, the assistants, they cleared the waiting room and they took us straight into the consulting room, which was absolutely fabulous, thanks to a little and kind of euphemistic note on her file that says she's a sensitive dog. But most of the time, though, words are not labels in as much as they are a commonly understood shortcut. That's what they are, a shortcut that stands for a definition, in the same way as like an anarchy A in a circle stands for a whole political belief system, as does a flag. Their meaning is generally clear and it stops you having to explain everything to people who already understand what that word means. So words are just symbols that stand in for more complex definitions. Are anxiety and fear then confusing, misused, meaningless shortcuts that are simply synonyms for each other? And that actually just depends on your school of thought when it comes to emotions and animals. Everything is just about your school of thought. So what do I mean by that? It's your school of thought. Well, some people don't believe that animals other than humans are even aware of their experience. French philosopher René Descartes was one of those individuals, and there are many scientists who feel like that. Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist John O'Keefe, he recounts an incident back in the 1990s when he said in a room of his colleagues, he said that a rat was curious, and he was there with his superiors, his colleagues. He was gently ridiculed, he reminds us. We've come a long way into accepting animal sentience and emotion state in the last 3 decades, but there are still many scientists who hold to their belief, and maybe will always hold to their belief, that only humans have emotions. And therefore, to speak of dogs having emotions is just ludicrous for them. Dogs might have defensive behaviours. We might share some of our freeze, flight, fight behaviours with dogs, but dogs can't experience, for them, anxiety or fear. That's their school of thought, and that would be the Cartesian school of thought. Others who might want to say that dogs feel anxiety-like or fear-like states with humans might not sit in that same school of thinking for the same reason. Those people might believe that animals do have emotion states, but that those emotion states are so different from our own human experience that to call them emotions is a bit like me using the word lump to describe a sebaceous cyst or a malignant tumour or an abscess or a reaction to an insect bite or an occipital protrusion seen in long-nosed dog breeds. Using the same word for all of those is just unhelpful and confusing, I might say. Some researchers believe that animals share primary emotions with humans. Fear is often described as being a primary emotion, and what that means is it's largely or entirely biological in nature. And because we share neural structures, nervous systems with our dogs, our responses to stimuli are largely the same. And those people view emotions as a biological imperative that's shared across species. But anxiety is not a primary emotion in most explanations of primary emotions. And therefore, there are many biologists in particular who would think that responses to stimuli that cause defensive behaviours that are hardwired, innate responses, things that you or I might call a fear response maybe, but they would think that it's doubtful that all animals could experience something like anxiety that's a more cognitive, more cerebral experience. It's on a different stratosphere of cognitive complexity. Talking about fear or anxiety in dogs, for them, might be a silly and pointless exercise for any of those people who come from these different schools of thoughts. And there are people who believe that emotions come in distinct packets, that there are categorical differences between anxiety and fear. Those words describe different experiences. So our biologists who think that dogs might experience fear but lack the cognitive competence to feel anxiety, they might fit in that category too, about hardwired distinct categories. For people like this, and many animal folk fit right into this category, the differences between anxiety and fear can be clearly defined if you sit down and think carefully enough about it. And there are people who believe, like me, that no such distinct and neat packages exist. Many neuroscientists and psychologists are finding themselves more progressively in this category with me. And there can be overlap between anxiety and fear, that to say they describe quantitatively or qualitatively different experiences is just silly, according to them and me. Some of these individuals might think that emotions are a construct, that the label is just a label, and we come to associate specific activities in our bodies and physiological states with that label through social mechanisms like language. And since animals don't have language, as far as we know, they have no means to pass on these constructs, so speaking of fear and anxiety in dogs just makes no sense to people like that, because emotions for them are constructive. And there are those who think that anxiety and fear are labels like this, but they're more rooted in our biology and our own sense of our emotion state. So for them, emotions generally split between good and bad. Like there are good emotions, bad emotions, things that make us approach stuff or avoid, things that are reinforcing or punishing. And sometimes folk from this school of thought see anxiety as just a milder form of fear, or fear is a more short-lived form of anxiety. But if you've ever had emotions, you'll know that it's actually not so easy as this. So essentially then, it comes down to your school of thought, and there are hundreds of schools of thought, that the interpretations that you find are most convincing based on the evidence that you've considered. So where do I stand? Well, I think emotions emerge from biology. They're emergent phenomena that arise from our bodies. They're part of that physical experience in response to stimuli out in the world, or even things in our own bodies. But I don't think fear and anxiety are easily put into neat boxes. There's too much crossover. But I also don't think the scale of them is how I want to label them. People might argue with that and say that anxiety is a milder form of fear, and I used to agree with that view until I really thought about it. And you'll see why when I explain how fear and anxiety and their overlap and the similarities and differences that I see between them. But I certainly have freewheeling experiences of anxiety that have been incredibly intense, worse sometimes than some of my fears. And when I explain those situations, you'll want to tell me that I was feeling fear or panic, or maybe stick a different label on it. Maybe you'll be right. And that just reminds us that it is really important that if we're using words at cross purposes and what they stand for isn't clear, to make sure that we are really clear about what we think they mean to us. So what is the difference between fear and anxiety, and what's the overlap? I'm going to use a little Venn diagram to share my views. I'm going to say this is very much rooted in the work of people like Mike Fanslow and others who followed in his wake. We'll be talking a lot about where the bad stuff is in relation to us, the thing we're afraid of, and its relation to us in physical space, when it will happen. Its relation to us in time, and what behaviours we might see with that, and what we do in response. But we'll also be talking about certainty and distance as well as learning. And there are some factors here as well about what the threat is as well. There's more nuance than can give to this diagram, I'm afraid to say. It's just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. So let's start with the differences between the two. Anxiety for me is anticipatory. It comes before we encounter the bad stuff. So let's say I have a mortal fear of clowns. Anxiety would be the experience I'd have if I expect to see clowns, but I haven't seen one yet. It's the feeling that I might get if I get stopped for a traffic violation, but so far so good, I haven't got one. It's the concern that I have that I might fill in my tax return wrong. It's a feeling that drives me to a search engine looking for all kinds of lumps on dogs' heads and catastrophizing that Liddy's lump is a hideous form of some very aggressive cancer that can't then be treated. That's anxiety. And this is one reason I don't believe that we can define anxiety as simply being a lesser form of fear, because some of my catastrophizing about what could be wrong has way outstripped my emotions once I actually knew what was going on. Okay, so if somebody did tell me it was a horrible form of cancer, that would be probably a relief, I would know. And that brings me to another point, that anxiety is about uncertainty. My anxiety, my fear of clowns, my being anxious about clowns is the state where I'm concerned that there might be clowns, but I don't know. Like, does today feel like a very clowny kind of a day? So fear, in contrast, that's the lexical shortcut I use to talk about feelings that come as a response to actually seeing and being in the presence of the ugly stuff, the icky stuff, up close and personal. Like, I have confirmed the threat. Clowns are in the area. Anxiety says maybe, and fear confirms my concern. Anxiety can also be about distance, though. Like, I know it's there, but the threat is there and it's very far away, or it's constant. Like, I'm never that far away from clowning material or a fast food joint that may or may not have a clown in the window. And maybe I'll be feeling anxiety if I see the clown far away, and fear if we're up close and personal. So anxiety might be the way in which I describe how I feel when threats are spatially distal, when they're far away, or when they're small. Like, I've got a small clown figurine in my bedroom. Not a real clown, and he is small, and I'm not terrified of clowns. But anxiety is generally much more cerebral, so it involves more cognitive complexity because it's anticipatory feelings about future stuff that may not happen, and that involves predicting potential threat. It involves calculations and cost-benefit analysis. It's time to weigh up whether the benefit of nipping into that fast food place with the clown, you know the one I mean, whether that's worth the risk of seeing a clown, and whether I'm maybe just a small picture that's very far away and I can ignore, or is it going to be like a man in a clown suit with a bunch of very freaky kids dressed up in clown suits too? But in contrast, when I talk about fear, I mean something that is much more biological than cognitive. A bloke suddenly appeared out of his driveway on Thursday morning in the dark whilst I was walking my dog Liddy, and he startled me. I jumped. Had he made a threatening movement instead of like say, morning, sorry, I think I startled you there, I'd have been ready to switch into fight or flight mode in a heartbeat. Liddy didn't jump, but she and I both startled when there was a loud bang went off just beside us. Yesterday there was thunder, and that startled both of us. So fear is something I'm much more sure that dogs have because it's rooted in their biological capacity, not in their cognitive capability. When I speak about anxiety, I mean also something that is contextual. I take this from a lot of literature on fear and anxiety, that locations, situations, events, where the stimulus that causes the emotion is so broad, vague, lengthy, and it's probabilistic rather than deterministic. It's about probabilities and percentages rather than definites and absolute factors, which would be fear. Finally, because it's all the space I've got left on my Venn diagram, anxiety for me is a lexical shortcut that I use to mean an emotion that gets in the way of my thriving behaviours. Like, it would interfere with sleeping and eating and social behaviours. So think back to the pandemic and maybe your own anxieties, how they might have interfered with how you shopped, how you socialised, how you greeted people, going on dates, for instance. Was there any swinging or like sneaky hanky-panky during the pandemic other than the British Minister for Health? Like, it affected how much time you spent outside the house, how much time you spent tending yourself and your nest, doing yoga in your dining room, buying a walking pad, spending outside, maybe painting your house, being in your garden, doing things up. So it changes our behaviour. Anxiety about some distal, vague, uncertain threat alters the behaviours that we'd prefer to do. And in comparison, fear just hijacks your behaviour completely, or almost completely. Your sympathetic nervous system takes over, and the closer, the more imminent a threat is, the less flexible our behaviour can then be. And there's also stuff, though, about what brings healthy anxiety to an end and what brings fear to an end. What brings anxiety to an end is usually the arrival of a safety signal, the need to return to thriving behaviours, the adoption of coping behaviours, or the shift to fear because the threat level increases. The threat gets nearer in time, in space, or both. And what brings fear to an end is the termination of the threat being over, or also its escalation that puts us in a state of panic, like our truly, completely inflexible fight or flight behaviour, or even passing out, which we might call tonic immobility in biology, or catatonia for other terms where you're just like so frozen you can't even move. There's a lot I can't squish in that diagram about how long these feelings might last, for example. Anxiety might be over quickly if there's a safety signal to say there is no threat, like my vet when she said it's just a sebaceous cyst. Like if we're very hungry, we dart into the fast food joint on a mission, we get out, we fill our bellies, no clowns encountered, we know the clown threat is over. Fear generally shorter-lived, but for me to say so with any categorical certainty would be absolutely wrong. So there's stuff to do also with social living, which brings anxieties of its own, and with social threat, like your boss arriving in a bad temper or living in an abusive relationship where threats might escalate periodically. Whether threat is a social one that you have to live with, it alters this diagram quite a bit. Learning histories also make it more likely that anxiety will slip into fear. If you have 100% been assaulted by killer clowns in the past, then anxieties might be more intense. And whether emotions are adaptive and healthy, functioning as they should, they exist for a reason, or whether they're maladaptive, that's another factor for another time and another discussion. We forget that anxiety's got a purpose, like it keeps us from harm, it helps us thrive optimally. Its purpose is generally avoidance, which is why it generally stokes vigilance and watchfulness. And fear has got a purpose too, a different one. Its purpose is escape once you've confirmed a threat, and that might be escape by avoiding detection, or it might be escape by running away if you can. Should the threat be very close, very urgent, then it's literally every dog and every woman for themselves. An attack then becomes part of a useful strategy about how maybe you would get out of there. But we have much less control over fearful behaviours and no control at all over panic behaviours compared to anxiety, where we have got more control over what happens. So what do they share then? Both fear and anxiety can be influenced by learning and experience. So if I've had horrible experiences with clowns, it might make me much more anxious in places where I expect to see a clown, or it might make me more sensitive to them when I spot them or I sniff them out. Both fear and anxiety can have innate, unlearned bits as well. We forget this, since to be human means that our own learning can easily overcome many of those ancestral fears. We are scared of strangers generally, but nobody would doubt that a wild rabbit has got an instinctive fear of hawks and falcons and things that might kill them. New things can generate both fear and anxiety, novel places, novel contexts that can be scary for many of our dogs until they've got a bit more certainty about what's going on. Novel stuff, even in familiar places, is easily detected. It's our most basic appraisal system. Novelty, even more speedy, ancient and ancestral than our appraisal system for a threat. We're better at spotting novelty than threat. And many dogs are scared of things that they don't know. So both of those can generalize though, so that we start to learn more things that cause those feelings. Like, is it just me, or does being a grown-up adult in this world just mean living in a state of constant risk awareness about just how many things can kill you? Like, both can be social and non-social, meaning that they relate to your own species or to fears of other species, or to other stuff like heights and slippery floors or loud noises. And both can be perceptual, where it's not actually a threat, it's just something that you perceive to be a threat. Like, were I truly afraid of clowns, you and I both know that being more scared of clowns than many of the very real threats, the very probable threats in our lives, is that's just simply about my perception, which will be very biased and shaped by my own learning experience, or lack of. Anxiety can be shaped by perceptions, biases, temperament, personality, and so can fear. So no doubt there are moments when you were thinking as I was speaking, but what about this, Emma? Or, well, this doesn't fit in your diagram. Good is what I say to that. I actually hope there were moments for you like that when you were thinking about anxiety and fear. That helps make my point that anxiety and fear, they don't sit in neat, tidy boxes, no matter how much we'd like them to. And we might resolve that by simply being clearer about the definitions of fear and anxiety, where discussion and thinking will iron out those differences. Or we might just agree that most things fit inside one of those categories, but the boxes were never meant to absolutely be exact. And in those cases, it's just sufficient to ask questions for clarity, like my vet did over the phone, to decide whether it's the kind of small lump that she really needs to see now, or whether it's the kind of small lump that can wait a week or even a month or more. Sometimes we humans, we wield our lexical shortcuts like anxiety and fear. We wield them very poorly, especially when we're anxious or afraid. All of this begs the question about whether it matters, and does it matter, that we define fear and anxiety differently. I think it really does from a treatment perspective, whether that's the exposure therapies that we may use with dogs whose anxieties or fears get in the way of their living, or whether it's from a medical perspective about the kind of medications or supplements that would work better with one or the other. And the difference absolutely matters if you're a neuroscientist, if you're a psychologist, or any other kind of researcher. You absolutely need to start with conceptual clarity, but that's a question to explore more fully some other time. Until then, I bid you a fond adieu and I welcome your thoughts on the topic.